Unwelcome but expected, the coronavirus has hit the UK.
Yesterday, the Chancellor unfortunately offered nothing to the 20 million people living in rented homes.
The UK has now become Europe's latest epicenter.
They're worried sick that they can't pay their rent if they get ill.
They're fighting a war here and they're losing.
I can indeed confirm that we will be bringing forward legislation to protect private renters from eviction.
It was really weird because you just sort of saw it on the news as a thing like, oh, you can't be evicted. But we were in the midst of an eviction.
I'm immunocompromised. I had no compassion for my situation.
They wanted to kind of bully us into staying at first. It was honestly so stressful.
Yeah, it kind of put me in a position where my health wasn't in a very good place.
Life isn't easy for private renters. A lack of affordable social housing has forced many into the private renting sector to deal with sky-high rents, constant disrepair, and now the threat of eviction during a global pandemic. When nearly 75% of private renters have no savings to fall back on, but 1 in 5 are expected to lose their job during the pandemic, it's clear that without major protections and a transformation of the current housing system, many people will be left homeless, in debt, and vulnerable during the biggest crisis since World War II.
I was renting a flat with a friend and we were given a eviction notice, so like a no-fault eviction notice, a month prior to lockdown happening. There was lots of talk about what was going to happen with the eviction. I say there was lots of talk, there was lots of worry from us and a lot of anxiety about it, but there was not a lot of communication from the letting agency or from the landlord about whether anything would be changing. I think it just got exacerbated by the fact that it wasn't just, oh no, we'll have to find somewhere else to live. It's, oh no, during a pandemic, we're going to have to, find somewhere. We were just left in the lurch completely.
James's eviction was an illegal revenge eviction. His landlord demanded that he and his flatmates paid for unproven damages, and when they refused, he evicted them.
We were told by our landlord that if we sort of fulfilled a list of criteria that he'd made, we would have the eviction stopped. We wouldn't have to move out, but these included sort of costs up to £2,500 for damages that he acknowledged were not done by us.
James's landlord also broke lockdown regulations and repeatedly entered the property to do unessential building work whilst James was self-isolating.
Lockdown happened around a month before we were meant to move out, and I isolated myself for 2 weeks because I wanted to move home to look after my parents. I was like, look, I'm isolating, can you just keep out of the way? But he still kept coming to the flat, even during lockdown, to do these work. And then, without telling us, moved our eviction date to 2 weeks early.
When James reached out for advice, neither the letting agency nor the council mentioned that this was an illegal eviction.
The difficult thing was there was such little guidance from the government about what happened in these situations. It was really weird because you just sort of saw it on the news as a thing like, oh, you can't be evicted. But we were in the midst of an eviction. What do we do? In this situation, by the end of it, I just felt so uncomfortable having to interact with the landlords so much that I was ready to go. I felt like just staying there any longer just was uncomfortable. It's been a big ball of anxiety for a number of months now, and I'll be glad to see the end of it, really.
Despite the eviction ban, 11% of workers have said that they have been evicted from their homes during the pandemic. So evictions were banned in theory, but what about the rest of renters' concerns, like going into arrears, the possibility of a national rent freeze, or rent reduction? Tenants have been urged to negotiate with their landlords, and landlords have been asked to find reasonable and compassionate solutions with their tenants. But this doesn't sound a lot like the reality of private renting. When the pandemic hit, Emma's landlord used a loophole in the contract to withhold hundreds of pounds from her deposit.
Our landlords initially accepted to surrender our tenancy, and then when the whole pandemic hit and pretty much the whole country went into lockdown, they tried to revoke it because I'm assuming they were concerned about getting another tenant in. They wanted to kind of like bully us into staying at first by saying that it's not actually legal for us to go home.
Emma and her flatmate were also sent false information about lockdown rules in order to pressure them into staying.
They sent us a bunch of emails that were threatening legal action. They also sent us a statement that they claimed was from the DPS saying that the terms of our contract still stand, which, I mean, we spoke to Shelter and they said that that's not true at all.
When Emma and her flatmate took this dispute to TDS, they ruled in favour of the landlord, and just like that, hundreds of pounds were taken from a casualised worker on a part-time contract and given to a landlord in ownership of multiple properties, including a flat in central London.
It was honestly so stressful because you can imagine that there's so many people that are in precarious living situations at the moment who've had to manage with massive loss of income, massive job insecurity for the future as well. And then in addition to that, like worry about relatives, about their personal health, about having to go back to work when it isn't safe yet just to pay rent. It was just insulting that they didn't treat us with any kind of compassion.
Due to the lack of clear government guidelines and protections that have left those like James and Emma evicted and financially vulnerable, many private renters have taken the struggle for safe, secure housing into their own hands.
I decided to move back to Belfast because I'm immunocompromised, so I sort of felt like I wanted to be near my family just in case I got sick or anything like that.
Darren followed the government's advice to try and negotiate with his letting agency, but they showed little compassion or leniency for his situation.
I still have 3 months of my tenancy left at that point, so obviously with being out of work I couldn't pay my rent at all, so I tried to explain that to them. Yeah, I got a pretty cold response from them, and it was pretty clear that all they cared about was getting their money. They had no compassion for my situation, and they had no regard for like how hard it was for me to be in that position where I'm having to spend all this money moving home all of a sudden.
The stress of the situation even began to negatively impact Darren's health during the peak of the pandemic.
So like I said before, I'm immunocompromised, and that's because I have a condition called ulcerative colitis. One of my main triggers for it, and one of the things that makes me ill, is stress. So obviously with SB Living, like constantly sending me emails telling me I had to pay for something I didn't have the money to pay for, that caused me a lot of stress, and yeah, kind of put me in a position where my health wasn't in a very good place. At that point, I got in touch with Acorn after sort of feeling like I was screaming into a black hole, and they helped me to devise a plan to try and get through to the letting agency in a more effective way. Once we emailed them and I had sort of the force of the union on my side, then that's when they responded, and they finally allowed me to not pay rent for those 3 months.
With the help and advice from the union, Darren managed to come to an agreement with his landlord, and he didn't have to pay the final 3 months' rent for a flat that he had to leave behind. But this hasn't been the case for many renters across the country.
I definitely felt unprotected. I mean, the thing at the time was like, oh, your rent can be delayed. But that was like no help for me, because it's like, what, I'm just going to go into arrears and then have to pay like £1,000 or £1,000+ that I don't have in 3 months' time. Like, how is that in any way helpful? Meanwhile, obviously, landlords were getting mortgage breaks. Like, there wasn't really much protection for renters. I felt like if I had been a younger student, I would have not been aware of Acorn and wouldn't have been aware of that support. And I'm sure there's so many people who aren't, and who just ended up getting into lots of debt paying the rent instead.
So there is power in a union, and organisations such as Acorn and the London Renters Union have been working tirelessly throughout the whole pandemic to provide support and resources for those facing the threat of rent arrears and eviction. But in a system where houses are seen as commodities for profit rather than homes for people to live in, the odds are stacked against us.
A ban on evictions put in place in March is due to expire in England and Wales on Sunday.
Where is the Housing Secretary on this? Where is the plan?
Here to stay, here to fight.
Charities estimate that hundreds of thousands of people with little to no savings have fallen behind on rent.
The issue is that even though landlords have been told to be compassionate during this period, it's a really loose term. It doesn't really carry any legal weight. It doesn't give them any guidance.
We've seen 20,000 people made homeless during the pandemic.
And a lot of that has been interpreted as they just do the bare minimum. So obviously you can't evict someone during the pandemic.
More than 170,000 have been threatened with eviction by their landlords or letting agents.
You should consider cutting the rent. You should consider allowing late payments of rent or a repayment plan. But that doesn't tackle the long-term consequences of what this pandemic has caused.
Eviction resistance.
In 3 days' time, what's going to happen to the 227,000 renters who've fallen into arrears during this pandemic?
It just means that your potential eviction is going to be delayed a little bit, or that you'll be in a lot of debt for a longer period of time.
We're fighting for the right to live, and so should